Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at the relationship that Great England had with the colonies. So let's get started. For the British, the idea of patriotism was one that was very strong. You had the power of the throne, the power of the state. You had rivals nearby you had to worry about. Taxes were high. You had to build your military. It was all about progress. It was all about moving forward. The British Constitution existed in that it had a lot of interesting characteristics to it. It provided for power of the people to create a government for themselves, while at the same time also having a monarchy. It had a House of Commoners where you could be elected, but you also had your House of Lords where you're just born into this title. Lots of colonists still viewed themselves as British, and they viewed the British system as the strongest one that existed. For them, liberty was starting to be associated, though, with resisting arbitrary government, when your government does something just to do it. The political idea of republicanism in this time promoted public life participation while also being economically independent. You should have a public face. You should be involved in the state. And you should also be able to make money however you want. Liberalism focused on the ideas of you, the individual, and your private life. So we see in this time that there are people who are both Republicans and liberals at the same time. Those who promote for the public good, those who want to make money their own way, and those who want their own individual rights. John Locke, one of the most well-developed writers of the Age of Enlightenment, said that governments should exist to protect the natural rights of the people, and that liberalism should focus on protecting your property as well as those rights, and that property did, yes, include slaves. Women slaves were a challenge to this because they were people but were not treated like people. They did not have rights, and in many places never could have rights. The requirement to vote had always been property. If you looked in English history for the past 1,000 years, that had been the case. The more land you have, the more power you have in this state. The problem came to be for the colonists that if you had land in the colonies, you could not vote. You had no political voice. No matter how much land you have, unless you're the governor, the proprietor, you do not have a voice. For most of the Brits, they were more concerned with what was going on in Europe with their imperial enemies being France and Spain, by building up trade, by collecting duties, and they felt by the first half of the 18th century that they didn't have to micromanage the colonies. This attitude of salutary neglect said they're fine, they'll do what they're going to do, they're going to respect us, they're going to pay taxes and duties, and we'll look in on them, but we don't need to guide everything they do. And with that autonomy, we see the rise of assemblies that start to exist. 9 of the colonies had governors, rulers of the colony, that were selected by the crown. But just because you have been picked by the crown to govern doesn't mean you manage every single thing every single way. You delegate, you diversify the workload so that smaller assemblies can take care of individual problems and individual components of said problems. The strongest, most powerful of these assemblies is going to be in Pennsylvania. Then we get to Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, and South Carolina. These areas had strong assemblies because the people there, number one, had money, independent of England, and independent sometimes of agriculture as well. One way that the colonies were radically different than anywhere else was the presence of printing presses. Printing presses existed elsewhere in the world. This wasn't like the only place that it existed, but the colonists were much more literate than many Europeaners were. There was a growing market constantly for new materials, new printed works, new political discourse and diatribes, bookstores, libraries, newspapers. All of these are places where information can spread. And these systems are delivered through the post frequently enough and swiftly enough that the same newspaper could be read by somebody in Baltimore and in Pennsylvania. In England, the ability to have free speech was reserved only for your legislators. Your average citizen did not have freedom of speech. And in England, prior to 1605, if you want to print something, you need a government license for this. And those things nowadays would seem surprising. And even in the colonies, they were definitely surprising. But the trial of Zenger, John Peter Zenger, really had an idea of how significant the rule of law and the freedom of speech and press were. And as the 18th century was moving forward, Zenger, who was a newspaper printer, was arrested for libel. He said that the governor was corrupt. Now here's the thing, the governor of New York was in fact very corrupt. He just put this all into print. And when Zenger was arrested, this looked like the deck was kind of stacked against him, because the governor said, you know, that's not right. You're automatically guilty. For how dare you make this? The judge in the case tells the jury, you need to think that printing something is a crime, whether it's true or not. Now, the idea that a sitting judge would say something that outlandish really was pretty crazy. Fortunately, though, Zenger won predominantly because his very successful lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, was able to defend his case. As the colonies moved closer and closer to revolution, we see that there is a return to religious fervor. And this was this was a huge transformation, because we had seen a more secular approach was happening in the colonies. So when the Great Awakening, a revival of spiritualism, happens, it's a huge deal. Two guys I want to address. First one is Jonathan Edwards. He was a preacher. He believed in emotionally moving people through and to the idea of fear. He talks about, you are damned, you are going to go to hell. If you are not believer, then you will suffer horribly by the Christian God. And probably his most famous sermon was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And throughout it, he uses poignant imagining illustrative concepts that, you know, man is like a spider dangling over a flame. God has a bow and arrow. He could just shoot you dead right now if he wanted to. The metaphor that hell is paved with the skulls of unbaptized children. It's like, this is really terrifying imagery that it pulls up. You don't even have to follow faith to think, wow, that's some scary stuff. On the total other side of that, we've got George Whitefield. And he said that, you know, we don't need to scare people. He wanted to inspire people. He wanted to motivate people. Now, that is a good goal, but Whitefield had the ability to, he was just an amazing public speaker. At one point he made Edwards weep with joy from a sermon. Ben Franklin, always skeptical of the next priest, at one point emptied his pockets, which included some gold, into the collection plate for Whitefield. One of the more interesting facts about him is he had a voice that would carry. And you may know someone in that life. You might be that person in your life that's just genuinely has a voice that can go forever. It was said that he could speak to an audience of 5,000 people using nothing but his voice, and every person could hear and clearly understand him. We see that there is a revivalism of new preachers, and this is going to be how they address their congregations, how they address the scripture, and that's going to be met with some skepticism by old light traditionalists who believed that the old way of doing things were the best way of doing things. The Great Awakening was the first religious experience that Americans as a whole could get together and get involved with. If you were a slave, if you were free and black, if you were rich and powerful, you were inspired and moved because of this. And the Great Awakening also created a bunch of new churches too. Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, Dartmouth. These are Ivy League schools that were created to, and in fact, because of the Great Awakening. When we look at how England viewed the rest of the world, you have to remember England was an empire. They viewed themselves as that thing. And they had plenty of rivalries out there. There's the Spanish that controlled Mexico, southwestern United States, a chunk of Louisiana. They had started to colonize Texas and set up these presidios, these military outposts. And where they went, usually Native Americans do not survive. Whether this is by extermination or the diseases, but it's also through assimilation. Spain sought to bring all these native folks into their new empire. The French empire in the Americas will include what is now Canada, the Mississippi River Valley Basin, and had much fewer colonists here. This group was actively trying to trade with Native Americans. You put all these different forces together, and it's no surprise that they're going to want to fight. The 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War, started in 1749 when some British settlers start moving into the Ohio Valley, and this is an area that was controlled by the French. Virginia gave these settlers lots of land and even established a Ohio company that would sell the land. And the French didn't like this because now the Brits are encroaching on their land. The Native Americans don't like this because now they're being slowly pushed off their land. The Native Americans and French are allies, and they view this encroaching British force as a real threat. This was not the first war that England had fought as an empire. This wasn't even the first war they had fought recently. There had been a series of successive wars that had happened earlier in the 18th century, and England had been able to both finance and win all of them. This one was different because they're not fighting nearby. They're not fighting in France, in Spain, on the border of England. They're fighting on the frontier. They're fighting on the other side of the world. And these are the most powerful empires in Western Europe that are duking it out in a land that's on the other side of the Atlantic. Now, the colonists started settling in 1749. It took another 5 years before the war really gets going. The British forces wanted to completely remove the French from the areas in the Ohio Valley. West of Pennsylvania, this is where we see the fighting begin. And it starts, and the British forces are led by a young George Washington. And he, as commander of forces, is really a spectacular commanding officer. For the first 2 years of the war, the French and the Indian forces were really successful in attacking the British, in taking the fight to the British colonies. It's not until 1757, with a new prime minister, does the British government start to really turn the tide. What happens is England starts gifting money to Prussia and Austria. These are two countries in Europe, and those countries had beef with France. So England gifts money to these two nations in the hope that they're going to attack France. France in the Americas is not going to want to fight in the Americas anymore. Now they have to worry about their homeland. And with that done, France is going to have their attention divided, their forces divided, and England is going to be able to strike back. In the Peace of 1763, when this was all done, France gives Canada to England, and in exchange, they get a couple of islands in the West Indies. They get Guadeloupe and Martinique. Spain is going to give Florida to England in return for the Philippines and Cuba. England had seized those in a previous war. Spain also got Louisiana from the French, which at this point, that's about a third of the continental United States. So that's definitely a good trade. It's a much better trade than just Florida. France's empire in North America is not going to be a thing anymore. Between everything they had to pay, all the land that they had lost, it was done. They were going to be able to influence northern Canada, part of Quebec, but that's really about it. Pontiac's Rebellion was begun by natives across Ohio, Indiana, and what would now be Michigan, who revolted against the expanding British Empire. And they wanted to keep the Proclamation Line present. And the Proclamation Line was a line that was essentially the Appalachian Mountains that said the colonists, the Brits, they wouldn't go farther west than this line. This was going to be it. And you can see on this map, this is where the Proclamation Line is. That middle area was going to be set up for the Native Americans. The agreement was very simple. England would stay to the east, the Native Americans would have that center part, and everything to the far left in that mustard color would be what Spain controlled. Again, this is why giving up Florida for all of that was a good deal for Spain. The colonists, though, they were very upset about this. They had been fighting in the 7 Years' War, had expected to get a lot of new land, a lot of new expansion, and now find they can't get that at all. So a small group known as the Paxton Boys, which were a group of Scottish and Irish individuals, start massacring Native American men, women, and children. They felt that the natives were being treated too well. And this really showed the end of good relations with the Pennsylvania Penn family with the Native Americans. Our final idea to end with is, as the 7 Years' War ended, colonists were more unified than ever before. And they also had started to create the idea of a national identity. 1754, Ben Franklin puts out the idea of this very infamous political cartoon, diatribe at least, of join or die, all together or all apart. We're all in this together. And he takes this to the British government and says, hey, maybe we should give the colonies a little more autonomy. Otherwise, sooner or later, they're probably going to want to bite back. And the British government thinks, yeah, that's never going to happen. It's 1763, and the colonists are more proud to be members of the British Empire, but also more independent of the British Empire than ever before. Today we took a look at how the British Empire and the colonies had a very interesting relationship. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.